All right, thanks, Noah, and thanks everyone that came out tonight to hear my musings and thoughts on how to improve game feel in 2D platformers. And as Noah mentioned, I'm monitoring for questions, and so I love fielding questions. So yeah, anytime something comes up, just shoot off a question, and I'll try to answer it. All right, so before we get into it, I just want to quickly introduce myself. And my background is in painting, but I actually wound up working as a mobile app developer for about 10 years when I found out I actually really enjoyed programming. And but in the last 5 years, I've been working on game dev in Unity primarily, and I founded a tiny game studio called Diesoft. Tiny meaning it's basically just me, but I do get help from some other very talented folks as well. And we're working on a game called Little Nemo and the Guardians of Slumberland. And it's a Metroidvania style game, but the moment-to-moment gameplay is more like a classic level-based platformer. And that's from working on this is where I'm drawing a lot of my talking points today. But that's not my only experience for this sort of thing. Possibly just as relevant as my experience with 40 years of playing platformers. I'm just kind of generally a big fan of 2D, retro, arcadey type stuff. I have lots of game hardware here in my office. Um, Obviously these aren't the only games that focus on like game feel, but I this is kind of speaks to my personal taste in terms of game feel, and I think you'll kind of understand that as we get into the things I'm talking about. How this my background of playing lots of like retro stuff and lots of NES and SNES era platformers kind of informs some of these topics. Um, all right, so what am I actually talking about today? Game feel niceties. What do I mean by that? It's kind of niceties meaning just like these are things you don't have to implement, but this is stuff that will kind of make everything feel a little better. And what is game feel? It's those immediate and tactile sensations you get from playing a game. So when you pick one up and in 5 seconds or less you're like, oh, this feels great. That's game feel. So I'm going to go over um, some of the mechanical details that I've observed to be very important for this, specifically as it relates to 2D platformers. I'm not sure how much this would, be relevant for other genres or other like 3D platformers. This might be fairly specific. And if you're unfamiliar with the term platformers, I'm kind of referring to anything where you're running and jumping, and those are like your primary actions. And I'm not going to get into programming details. I'll just be speaking about these things somewhat in the abstract. But I do love to chat about game programming stuff. So if you want to get in the weeds about this stuff, please DM me. And I love chatting about game programming details. And at the end of the slides, I have my contact info. And here on the right side of the screen, I have some links that have some good talks on the topic. I'll be referencing some of these throughout. And I recommend checking all of these out if you haven't seen them. I can share these slides later, by the way, so it's like so that you all can have access to these links. And the top one is just a devlog post that I did a while back, and that sort of was the beginning of the idea for this talk. So a little bit of what's in there will be in this talk. All right, so what am I not talking about? I just kind of want to establish that I'm not going to be talking about game juice, and this is generally a very important part of game feel. And I think for some people this is game feel, but I'm more interested in and going to focus on the mechanical details that you can implement to improve game feel. And this is just an image I found from a blog post about game juice, which if you Google that, you'll find all sorts of great talks and etc. about how to juice up your game. So check that out separately. All right, so first up, I want to talk about forgiveness mechanics. This is what Seth Coster of Butterscotch Shenanigans referred to these ideas as in one of the talks I linked to above. And I mostly just want to start here because I think it's one of the more interesting things to touch on, though I don't necessarily think it's the most important. I think it's just kind of like these are fun and interesting. And I personally find this to be a fun topic because I think these are the sorts of things that you often don't actually see in NES and SNES era platformers. So I like to think of these as like quality of life improvements that we can do that just kind of give us a leg up when we're competing with these classics of the genre. And some of these things I came up with to address problems I was seeing specifically when playtesting Little Nemo, but other things you'll likely have heard of before, such as coyote time. This is one of those mechanics that has become pervasive enough that I imagine a lot of you have probably heard of this, and I think there's even a bit of an expectation for it at this point. But for those unfamiliar, what is it? So coyote time is when you allow a player to jump for a short time after they've already walked off a ledge. So, presumably you shouldn't be able to jump. And you can see here an example of it in this GIF I have of Little Nemo jumping approximately 6 or 7 frames after walking off that ledge. So why would you want to do this? It's just as simple as sometimes people hit the button late. And when you're trying to make a big jump, you're likely wanting to jump as late as possible. And so when the difference of a single frame of I was on and now I'm off can mean the player falls into a deadly pit, it's just nice to give them a little extra time. So if the player clearly wanted to jump, let's let them, even though a strict reading of the scenario would tell us that they can't jump. And that's kind of the general gist of these forgiveness mechanics. And again, I think Seth Coster in that GDC talk does a great job of kind of summarizing this. But we're just trying to anticipate what the user wants and like correctly satisfy what they're trying to do. And a quick side note about coyote time is I recommend when you're building levels, don't require the use of coyote jumping because except for maybe like secrets for your more skilled players, that obviously is fine and fun. But keep in mind that like this is like a fail safe, right? Most players, and I've watched a lot of people that are also like unfamiliar with platformers play Little Nemo, and I'm always as someone who plays a lot of these and obviously has played a lot of Little Nemo, My Little Nemo, I mean, it's always surprising how people play differently, and I've noticed people jump well before they're going to fall off the ledge typically. I think jumping as you get closer to the ledge is something people will do as they get more comfortable with the game. So yeah, just something to keep in mind there about coyote time. All right, so the next mechanic here is I call this collider squeeze. I think this is a fairly common forgiveness mechanic, but maybe you've heard it called by a different name. Someone out there, I'm sure, has come up with a better name for this. I've seen other people mention this. Again, Seth Coster in the GDC talk also mentions this, although for some different use cases. But this is simply when we adjust the player's physics collider to get more desirable collision results. And okay, so what does that mean? Desirable collision results meaning essentially the user wanted to do this thing, but they hit something, so let's fix that. Or just, you can also just manipulate. You just want the game to work a certain way. You can use this for that. And so there's a few reasons I do this in Little Nemo. You can see in the screen cap in the upper right, sometimes you just want to help the player jump when technically their collider is stuck underneath something. So we just let them clip into the terrain and then rely on the physics system to push them back out again. And they kind of just get shunted out to the right a little bit, and that works out nicely because you're mostly not under the thing. You as a player, you kind of expect that to just work. In the bottom left one, you see a different use case where I squeeze in the bottom of Nemo's collider. And this isn't technically a forgiveness mechanic. This is kind of a different use case where I'm using this just to make sure that the player isn't floating off the edge, because your sprite doesn't always perfectly fill up your your physics collider. So to make things match a little better, you can just do that and make sure they fall off. Whoops, my headset turned off 1 sec, which is fine, I guess, because I don't need audio as long as nobody else is talking. So I don't have a screen cap for this, but when moving horizontally, you may want to squeeze the collider vertically on the top and or the bottom. And I do this in Nemo on the bottom of the collider, and that just kind of helps people make big jumps. So you're a little taller, or well, I guess that's not even true. It's kind of like crouch jumping, I guess, automatically for you when you squeeze in the bottom of the collider. Is I suppose a good way of thinking about it. And you can see in the editor view here, I have in the upper left, this is just a visualization of the collider squeeze. So the yellow lines better describe what the kind of interpreted collision behavior of the box collider is. These are specific to the direction of the collision. So it's like if we're talking about a vertical collision, that'll squeeze differently than a horizontal one. It's how you implement this will vary depending on what your physics system looks like. But generally, that's how I'm thinking about this because everything in Nemo is boxes. All right, so on to the next one. Hang time. This, I suspect, is probably a fairly common mechanic, but I don't recall seeing anyone explicitly mention this in some of the videos I've watched about this stuff. But it's just letting the player briefly float at the apex of their jump. And this is assuming you're probably using gravity to jump. And so, like in Nemo, all I'm doing is just turning off their gravity for a couple frames at the apex. This is something that I decided to do after I was watching people play Little Nemo, and I would find they were missing jumping up onto ledges that were equal to their maximum jump height. So they would jump a little too early and come up just a bit short. And this is a little bit exacerbated because in Little Nemo, you can jump exactly 3 units upwards. Whereas I think typically in platformers, your jump height is a little more arbitrary. And so you'll often jump over the thing you're trying to get to and then come back down onto it. But I didn't want to sacrifice that. I kind of like the exactness of the 3-unit high jump. And that's mostly just personal taste. But I found adding the hang time kind of alleviated this a little bit. And after implementing this and with the collider squeeze, I found there's less people getting just coming up just shy of landing on a ledge that they were aiming for. It's actually kind of wild how well this works, even though it's dead simple. Like I said, you just ignore gravity at the apex of the jump for, I think I'm doing it for like 5 frames if they're holding the jump button, or you could do it automatically too. And you can't even tell that you're floating. It just feels like a part of the curve of the jump. And you can, tweak how long that lasts and get different effects. But I found it's just like with the sweet spot, you don't even know it's happening, but it does make a difference. All right, so that is hang time. On to the next mechanic. This one's a little more, maybe more specific to Little Nemo, but again, related to missing jumps. I noticed that players were missing jumps when they were just trying to get onto a single, a tile that's 1 unit above where they are, so just like a real short hop. They would tap the button and actually tap it too quickly. And it was like, okay, well, you never have a reason to ever jump less than 1 unit high. So why do we even let that happen? And since I was already seeing that issue with people jumping to full heights, I added both min and max jump timing inputs. And so I guess, like, what does that mean? It's just if you press the jump button for a single frame, we just effectively hold the button for you a little bit longer so that you always jump a minimum of 1 unit upwards. And similarly, if you hold the jump button until just before your max height, but then you released it too early, and again, this is mostly only a problem because of the exactness of the jump, we'll go ahead and hold it for you a little longer so that you will reach the max jump height. And that prevents you from jumping short in both cases, both for a short hop and for a full hop. And you can see here a screenshot in Unity of just like my specific parameters for how I set this up. Although, again, these numbers aren't important to you because these are just based on other specific jumping and gravity parameters. But I just thought it'd be kind of interesting to see how, whenever you press jump, you're pressing it for at least 25% of the time of the jump. And if you press it after 70% of the full height of the jump, you'll continue on to a full height jump. All right. I'm just gonna take. If you hear me pausing briefly, it's just me sipping my tea. All right. So onto collider sizes. This isn't really a mechanic, but it does tie into the idea of like forgiveness and just being kind to the player. This is more of a philosophy to keep in mind while authoring things. But you should always tend to make things more generous for the player. So the player's hurt box, as I usually refer to it, which the part that's hit by attacks, should be smaller than you might expect. And enemy hurt boxes should be larger than you might expect. And kind of same thing for hit boxes. Enemy hit boxes should be smaller than you might expect, but the players can be larger. And similarly, make the collision size for your collectible items nice and large, so things are easy to collect. So you're never sort of like thinking you grabbed something but you didn't actually. Like for little things like in Nemo, it's like candy and moons. Make sure those collection size boxes are nice and large. And you can see in this editor view here, this is an enemy from Little Nemo, and the yellow box is the part of the enemy which can be hurt. So that makes sure it's nice and hard to miss the enemy when you attack. And you want that to be at least as large as the sprite for the enemy, would be my suggestion. And then meanwhile, there's the red box, which is the part that hurts the player if they touch it. And this is smaller to give the player a little more leeway. And this one you generally want smaller than the sprite for the enemy, because you don't ever want the player to think like, to sort of disagree with whether or not a collision happened. So you just always be more generous so that if they do get hit, they're sort of like, yep, yeah, that's on me. And yeah, that's kind of it for, those are all the forgiveness mechanics I want to talk about. I think most of these are probably relevant for any platformer. But you'll probably just want to do playtesting of your game and see where are players failing and come up with ways that you can help them. Ultimately, this, I think it won't feel like hand-holding for them, but it'll likely just kind of register as the game being more responsive, and like they'll probably track it as like, oh, it behaves correctly. The game is doing what I wanted it to do. So I think, it's easy to think of this like, oh, I'm going to make the game too easy. But, I think difficulty is like a completely separate concern, I think, from this. It's best to kind of like, if you want to make things more difficult, you can, but I think start with these sort of like ways of being kind to the players and generous. And so that's forgiveness mechanics. But I have other things we can do, other game feel niceties we can do. Another topic that I think is probably the most important, like more so maybe than all of those forgiveness mechanics. And maybe this is, personal preference, I think, but I care a lot about input handling. As you saw from my earlier slide, I have like some silly controllers and I like to play on CRTs and stuff. And a lot of that is just because I care a lot about like really precise inputs and timing and stuff. And thus you won't be surprised to see that one of the top things I want to talk about is reducing input latency. I think this is for me personally, when I'm judging how a game feels, input latency is like probably the very first thing that I clock and like determine like, feel if it feels like it's a problem or not. And you might be thinking, well, this doesn't really have much to do with me. As the developer of the game, this is more about like the player's hardware, the system OS, or even the input handling of the internals of the engine I'm using, etc. But you do have some control over this. And when you're building your input handling systems, it's important to find a structure and timing for your systems that'll allow your game to react to a button press as soon as it's told about it. Sorry if you're getting that sound effect of my headset turning off. So without being considerate about how your input systems run with respect to your gameplay systems, it's easy to inadvertently add a frame or even more maybe of latency to important actions like running and jumping. And I already mentioned like platformers are run and jump games. Those are your core gameplay mechanics, and you want to make sure that those work as they're as responsive as possible. And I'm not going to go into details here. I just put this doc here just to give an idea. This is like something I wrote up when I was figuring out early on how to structure my input systems to make sure I was making things work with the fact that I have systems running the fixed update and the simulation system update. And I was just kind of figuring out how I want everything to work. And so I kind of just, came up with a doc to attack that and make sure I was handling things correctly. But generally speaking, it kind of just boils down to, as you can see on the right image, just make sure you're reading in the inputs as early as possible in the frame, and that happens before your gameplay systems that actually do handle those inputs happen. And you kind of that's kind of all you really I suspect all you really need to do here to kind of make sure you're not introducing input latency. And that's kind of the goal here. There's a quick and easy way you can test this is if you're using Unity, and I imagine other engines probably have something similar, is just pause the game, press the jump button or hold it down, advance one frame, and just ensure that you're immediately seeing your jump start on the next frame. And then you just do the same thing for your movement inputs. And so if you're doing that and your actions happen as soon as you advance the frame, you should be golden. That means your systems are not happening in some order where you're not actually doing the movement until a frame or two later. And of course, this is going to be pretty important for platformers, which are, very action-based typically. All right, so the next input-related thing I want to talk about is input buffering. We talked about coyote time as like a way to address player mistakes when somebody hits a button too late, but probably an even more common problem is pressing a button too early. And this is really easy to solve actually with input buffering. You just kind of pretend the player hits a button for a bit longer after they've released it. So when the player presses jump too early and they're still a little bit off the ground, assuming you can't jump in the air, the jump will register on the first frame that they do actually hit the ground. And you'll sometimes hear people refer to this as jump buffering, just because that's one of, jumping is like one of the most important ones to get this right for, to like make sure you're doing input buffering for. Because you don't necessarily need input buffering on everything, but for jumping, you definitely will want that. And this is probably relevant for like all of your like kind of major, especially like mobility actions, but this is the big one. And I'm using Rewired, which is an asset that I purchased that works with Unity. I'm using that to handle inputs rather than the Unity input system. And it just has a dead simple option that you can just tell it how long you want inputs to be buffered for, and then you can decide which inputs do or do not use that buffer. And I don't know if Unity's input system has something like this, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if it did. So this might be as simple as just sort of like leveraging an existing feature of whatever you're using to handle your inputs. And you'll probably have to do a little something in your kind of gameplay logic to make sure that it works with that potentially, but nothing complicated, just sort of like you know, in the case of Rewired, for instance, it just has more frames. Typically, it'll only say the button is down on the first frame that you pressed it, but when it's buffered, it'll continue to say it's down. So you just want to make sure you're handling that gracefully. And this tweet here I just found while searching on the topic and thought this was a great sort of visual aid. So I put this on here. So thanks to Case Portman for coming up with this little visual aid on jump buffering. All right, so responsiveness. So this, responsiveness can mean, I suppose, a lot of things to different players. I'm specifically using this as a topic to talk about making sure actions happen immediately. And this is separate from like input latency, but just like sometimes you might be tempted to include like an animation before something happens. And in this screen cap here, I have a player character, Nemo, and a non-player character, the little buddy, and their jumps are a little different. And you can see Nemo jumps immediately, but the little buddy has 2 frames of wind up for the jump. And obviously, Nemo's jump would look cooler having something similar if Nemo kind of scrunched up before the jump. But the problem with that is you would then not be jumping when you press the jump button. And I want the jump to be very responsive. It's like, again, drilling that home, that's like a core mechanic. And the platformer, you want to be extremely responsive. And if you spend time showing off this nice jump anticipation pose, it'll just feel sluggish. Whereas if you do it for an NPC character here, it looks nice, and it doesn't feel bad if you're not in control of it. Other actions, it might make sense to have some anticipation frames for, like maybe an attack action. It's okay to put a little weight behind it and stuff. I believe Nemo's yo-yo attack, I have like just like one, or I think it's only like 1 frame, but I do give it just a tiny bit. Excuse me, just a tiny bit of anticipation of like wind up for the attack, and I think that just kind of helps a little bit, but I do still want it to come out quickly. All right, so inputs, responding to inputs. Sometimes players will just press buttons for no particular reason, and reacting to these unnecessary button presses will usually get like a really positive response from your players. So even if these on-screen actions are completely superfluous, I think they do make the game feel better. This is game feel. So these 2 examples I have here from Little Nemo, spinning and crouching. The crouching does kind of do stuff, but they're both effectively fairly superfluous. And the crouching I actually didn't even have early on in Little Nemo development. I knew I didn't want the players to be able to crouch walk, and that kind of comes down to one of the downsides of hand animating everything, is that simple mobility options quickly get out of hand for animating, especially because I have separate item carrying versions for most actions. So crouching seemed like a bad idea to introduce, since it wouldn't effectively do much and would just beg the question of why can't I move when crouching? And so I was kind of worried about the can of worms it would open. But after watching some people play Little Nemo, I started to better appreciate that even though down plus jump is the standard input for falling through some of the inputs to me, like as far as I'm concerned, and that's what happened, but that's what you do in Little Nemo. So these platforms you can see in the screen caps up above Nemo's head, for instance, you can pass through those by pressing down and jump. And I showed the inputs to the player right away, but I wanted to do a little more to help with that, to help like learn that input. And I decided to add a duck because I see this having 2 benefits. And the one is, again, this like just do something when buttons are pressed is good. And then also when the player presses down to pass through a platform, you start to get a little feedback because, that's 2 button presses. So if you press a button and nothing happens, maybe you're sort of starting to feel like you're on the wrong track. Whereas if you if Nemo reacts with a downward motion and you want to go down, it's sort of like, okay, yes, I'm pressing the right button combo. This is working. And it's one of those things that it's very subtle, but I think I suspect it probably helps reinforce the right inputs there. And yeah, I did end up ultimately this became something that I used later on with, I think, the crouching is like fun with moving platforms too, because you can like crouch under things. So I did leverage that a little more, but I think it started essentially just as something superfluous. I don't know how I don't know how to tell how successful it was, but I think just the fact that I sometimes see players repeatedly kind of crouch as they're getting a feel for the game suggests that I'm on the right track here, and helps the game feel more like a fun toy. And that's kind of the goal here, is like it makes the game feel more toy-like. And I think the reason I jumped to that word is, toys are tactile, and we're talking about game feel. The spin on the left here was a lot more work to draw than the crouch because it's many more frames, and it's even more superfluous. But the reaction is always extremely positive to this. It doesn't have any gameplay side effects, but people will just sometimes, maybe they're in the midst of a boss fight and it's like a little moment of levity. They're like trying to get away from something, they start spinning, or they're just like standing around or walking around. They're just sort of like fidgeting, right? Like people often fidget with the controller and with inputs. And if somebody's spamming left and right and they if the character starts to spin, I don't think I've ever been watching somebody play and they didn't like smile when the first time that happened. And they didn't. Sometimes people will be like, oh, does this do something? But most of the time people are just like happy to understand, like, oh, it doesn't do anything, it's just fun. And yeah, just kind of like suddenly the game feels a little nicer. Like you're controlling more of what's going on the screen. Like more of what you're doing is having on-screen side effects, and that feels nice. So I lied a bit earlier because I said I wasn't going to talk about game juice, and you could make a good argument that this topic of transition animations and secondary animations is game juice. But I did want to take a moment to talk about these because I think maybe these possibly get overlooked a little bit when talking about game juice. But whenever you can add an animation that would happen at the start or end of some action, and you can do it in a way that you can cleanly cancel out of that action and back into other actions, I think you should consider doing so. Sorry, I'm just gonna take a sip of tea. So the example here is the landing squish for Nemo. People always react really positively to this when like upon first inspection of the game, and I think it's just because it allows Nemo to react to something you've done in a simple, cute way. Like you're jumping constantly. All right, let's have some. You have the jump animation, obviously, but like let's do more. What else can we do? And a landing squish makes perfect sense. And we have two versions of that. There's the full landing squish, which ends with a little jiggle, and you can see that one here when Nemo just does a jump and doesn't move. You get the full like little squish afterwards. And then we truncate it if you're moving. And that's just because if you let that longer one play, it would start to look awkward that Nemo isn't running and is moving. Because obviously we definitely don't want to stop movement just for the sake of this landing squish. I mean, maybe you have a use case where you land from a fall, a very high fall, and you do want some sort of moment where you kind of jiggle and can't move. But just for a standard one, a standard jump, you wouldn't want that. And so because this is completely secondary and sort of like game feel or juice, you want to be able to truncate it if they're running and it would look weird. And also you want to be able to cancel out of this. So if you immediately jumped again, or if you use your yo-yo or something, obviously you need to be able to get out of this. It's not like a part of Nemo's like proper like state machine, if you will. It's just kind of superfluous. So yeah, I think people tend to focus on effects, like visual effects, when talking about game juice. So I just wanted to touch on this briefly because I do leverage this a lot in Little Nemo. I try to put these in wherever I can. Okay, so next topic I want to talk about is acceleration curves. Kind of, it's kind of an awkward name for this, but I was trying to kind of figure out what to refer to. Not the specific, these acceleration curves aren't a mechanic in and of themselves, but it ties into your core mobility mechanics of moving and jumping. I think it's really important to think about your acceleration curves. And I just want to talk a bit about those and kind of how you should be thinking about them in general when you're sort of starting out with a platformer that you're working on. So for movement, I'm sure you're all familiar with, I hope, with Super Mario Brothers. If you're not, you have a kind of wind up to top speed and then a short little slide as you come to a stop. And you can contrast that with Mega Man on the lower right, where you always just have perfect control of your character. There's no sliding around. Well, obviously there's a slide movement you could do, but when you press left, you immediately start moving left, and you can just turn on a dime, immediately go right. And these are two very different ways to handle it. And you could do anything in between or go further, make even more acceleration, like a slower acceleration curve. I think the important thing is that you just you're thinking about this stuff and deciding what you want, like play around with these. With Little Nemo, I wanted the player to have very immediate control over the movement in both the air and the ground. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but later. But just kind of be thinking about this. Look at other games for how they get a feel for what you like and sort of what you want to feel like, what games you want to feel like. And then there's aerial mobility. A lot of times this will be similar to the grounded mobility, but it doesn't need to be. Here are two very different examples from the same franchise. In the upper left, you have Castlevania 3 and the earlier NES Castlevanias, where when you jump, you're committed to that jump. You cannot do anything to affect it. You can either jump straight up or you can jump forward, and that's what you've got. But again, to contrast that, you have Alucard in Symphony of the Night here. Just you have complete control over your character here when you're in the air, and that's just a very different feel. And so, yeah, like I said, I wanted that snappy input like Symphony of the Night and Mega Man for Little Nemo, and but I didn't, wasn't necessarily fully committed to that, and that you can have maybe features. For example, here I have some ice, and that gives you a completely different feeling when you're on it. And when so in my case here for the snappy input, I have direct control over the player entities translation. So when you're moving, you're just translating the character. But then we can leverage the physics when we're on the ice. So all the movement systems are suddenly, when you're on the ice, they're like, okay, we're gonna switch to, instead of moving by moving Nemo's translation, we'll switch and we'll affect Nemo's velocity and acceleration instead. And that way, when you try to turn around, you're sliding. You kind of you can tweak those parameters and get it to feel just right, and how slippery the floor is, and etc. And this even it's kind of subtle, but you can even see this as impacting Nemo when Nemo jumps. You're also getting that icy feel. You don't necessarily have to do that. I just wanted to do that because I just didn't want you to be incentivized to be bunny hopping if you're on the ice. That would have just kind of felt sort of made the ice just kind of oh, you just jump and it's fine. But yeah. Oh, thanks for the shout out on the ice texture. Yeah, that was I I worked a lot on the I developed sheen effects for my shaders specifically for this domain, for this zone, for the ice and for those presents. So I appreciate the shout out on that. All right, so on to the next. So also we talked about aerial mobility, but there's also the jump itself. That the jump curve, you're also going to want to think a lot about. And again, there's lots of great examples here, but I think, again, just to take two different games from the same franchise, in Super Mario Brothers, you have a very different, you have like two halves of this jump arc, and they're very different when you're going up versus when you're coming down, versus the Super Mario World does a more kind of gravity-based jump where you have some velocity that pushes you off the ground, and then gravity is always pulling you back down. I think this is something that I just really, in Nemo, I use the kind of Super Mario World style, just use gravity, and I just, after toying with it, I was just like, oh yeah, that's exactly, like, it just immediately felt right to me, and maybe that's from playing a lot of Super Mario World. Although I was a little bit surprised because I actually expected to want to go in and be fidgeting with Super Mario Brothers, like custom acceleration curves for a jump. But yeah, if you like kind of the classic gravity based jump, I think it feels great. So, but yeah, I think it's probably worth like at least go play these games and see how you feel about them. Like any of these old like platformers, and you can kind of like see how just kind of inspect how their jumps work, get a feel for them. There's also like, of course, like jumping height and everything you'll have to consider, but I think the curve, I think, is the most important part of the jump. All right, so I just wanted to wrap up with some thoughts on just like kind of thoughts I'm using on like physics, kind of specifically 2D physics. For Little Nemo, I ended up building my own relatively simple physics system. This isn't something I recommend necessarily, but it has allowed me to apply my own way of thinking about platformer physics to the game, which I've really appreciated. And I thought I'd talk about a bit about some of the core like weird ways I have of thinking about these things, since physics are so important to how a game feels. And so I just have this one. I'm probably just going to talk over this slide for a little bit, with just some like silly early development screen caps of Little Nemo and like me trying to get the physics right. And so in Little Nemo, everything, at least as far as the physics system is concerned, is an axis-aligned bounding box. That's just basically a rectangle that never rotates. And that keeps things really simple. And it also just kind of has a nice retro feel. And again, that's like probably a lot of like personal taste. But I find with rectangles and with like simple collision logic, the results of the collisions are generally very obvious, I think. And so like the player kind of will understand how a collision will play out, and because they play out in really simple ways, which is like something hits another thing and stops typically. So you can contrast that with like, if you were sort of using, let's say you were just like using Unity's base physics, and you had like a capsule collider for your player, and you were standing on an edge, and you sort of started slowly slide off of it. Little things like that kind of happen with if you're using sort of like a more modern sort of, I think that's like a fairly common way to do things, like a capsule collider for a player and using like traditional physics. But yeah, I creating my own system here allowed me to keep things really simple, and I think that makes them more predictable, which I think helps with game feel. And you can see in this bottom screen cap here, where I have all the visualizers for the colliders turned on. The way Nemo just kind of, again, this is probably like just me being a weirdo, but like the way Nemo slots into these single tile gaps, I really like the feel of that. And so I was like, yeah, this is what I want. This is kind of what I'm going for. And so um the as I was working on that, I was originally using just sort of like kind of my own logic on top of the physics, the Unity physics, and just kind of was like, you know what, I'm just gonna write my own like simple box-based physics system because I was having trouble getting I'm if you couldn't tell from this talk, I care a lot about the details. And I was having trouble getting the details exactly how I wanted. And that's kind of why I ended up doing this. And another nice thing about everything being a box here, aside from it being really simple and predictable, is it's very easy to consider collisions from different directions differently. And actually, my physics system it doesn't even do, it only does axis aligned physics. So like each time, whenever something moves, it's considering its movement on those two axes only. So it's like, okay, let's do horizontal, and then we'll do vertical, or vice versa. I honestly don't even remember which order it does them in. It's not really important, but that allows me to do some interesting things like consider physics, consider your physics collider differently from different directions. So, for instance, something I frequently do in Little Nemo is have things that you can pass through. You can like walk right by them, but you can also stand on them. And in that case, I can just make sure that they can say like, oh, only my top is collidable, but that's it. And that's just kind of a nice little way that it works out neatly. And again, it has like kind of it has like a very retro feel. I think a lot of what I'm doing here is trying to mimic the physics of platformers from like the NES, and I think this does a good job of that. So one of the other things I do that's probably like super weird. This might be terrible. I don't know. Somebody could probably sit down. I could like explain the system. And they would be like, no, you're doing that all wrong. But I don't do the typical like static, kinematic, and dynamic. And instead, my collisions have dominant and non-dominant entities. So a collision is always between two entities, and one of them is like the dominant entity in that case, in every collision. And this works nicely for me because I don't usually have two things that are colliding and bouncing off one another. Because I'm not like trying to do physicsy things, I'm like physics simulations. I'm typically like something standing on something or stacked on something. Or you're just kind of like colliding with the world or like on a moving platform. And so having these sort of like dominant and non-dominant things works out nicely. Yeah, the dominant thing is like basically that's the one that like wins out in the collision. So if two things are colliding and something is dominant, it's not affected by the collision basically. But the other thing is the non-dominant entity will just stop. And so it's not like, obviously I can also have like restitution and stuff, so you could potentially bounce off of it. But the default case is just you hit something, you stop. So in the bottom one, for instance, obviously in all of these collisions with the world geometry, Nemo is the non-dominant entity and the world collision is the dominant entity. So yeah, this is all probably pretty weird, and it might be going overboard and probably a little bit unique to like a 2D retro feeling platformer. Excuse me, just gonna sip some tea. But this kind of control over something that's foundational is how collisions are handled. It allows me to approximate more like naive and retro feeling physics, and so and again, like the physics system was not a ton of work. It was like relatively simple as far as building out physics systems go, because it's all just boxes. It's really easy to calculate collisions between boxes, with axis line bounding boxes specifically. I mean, all right. So I just kind of want to recap because I touched on a lot of kind of overarching topics here. So forgiveness mechanics help players execute actions they intended to when they make mistakes. You'll probably need to come up with your own for your game, but generally just like try to be really, default to being really kind to your players and try to anticipate things that they'll get wrong, and also like watch from playtesting, see what people are getting wrong, and then come up with mechanics where you can like fudge what happened to make even the wrong answers actually be correct. And yeah, that's basically forgiveness mechanics. And again, like that's not, don't think about that as making the game too easy. Think of difficulty as like a separate thing, a separate knob you're going to tweak distinct from these forgiveness mechanics, because these will feel correct to a player. These won't make the game feel more or less hard. Excuse me. So for input handling, make sure you just respond quickly to inputs and utilize input buffering. It's probably you're very likely you're using something like some technology that will have input buffering as an option. So try to look into that and see if that's something you can do. And also acceleration curves. Make sure you get your animation curves for your game's primary mobility actions like run and jump really nailed down early on and get them feeling just how you like. You might have other things that have like other movement options that are besides run and jump that are equally important. I think for Nemo, those are the big ones. But yeah, pin those down early. I think ideally what you want to do for these is just get a rectangle moving around on a screen full of rectangles for world collision, kind of like this on the bottom without all the art. Like do that and get that feeling how you want to make sure your acceleration curves like feel good, and then it'll just feel even better once you add those secondary animations and all those forgiveness mechanics, etc. And for 2D physics, if you're into programming, don't be afraid to write your own dead simple physics system. Obviously, not everyone's, even if you're programming video game, you might not be like really interested and into programming like I am. So it's like obviously not for everybody, but 2D platformers are relatively simple in this regard. And I imagine you can achieve what you need with enough tweaking in a pre-made physics solution. Like I could have continued using Unity's raycast to do everything. But I think ultimately I was able to make things probably a little more performant, but also just kind of the important thing for me was just like getting into work, having control over all the little things to get everything feeling just right for me. So those are all the topics. Yeah, so I guess anybody have any questions? And also here's all my contact information. Oh, and also you should well, I'm waiting to see if anybody has any questions. If this was at all interesting, if this was an interesting talk to you at all, I have a link here to my devlog. I post once a month because for my Kickstarter, and then I trailing 6 months behind. I post those on this website, so you can see all sorts of fun details about how I'm working on the game, and also some other sort of just different posts about just sometimes my musings on these sort of technical topics. And if you're into pathfinding, I did a lengthy blog post on that.